Okay, sorry guys, I had to cut it off because it was almost time for 10 minutes. So I had to do another one, part 2. For this one, sorry about that, I tried to condense it into just one version with the 10 minutes limit. But, sorry, but let me continue. Well, thanks for bearing with me. And the sea, I was talking about the sea, and Jesus Christ is in control over the sea. Now, let's go to the third one. Now, we talk about the earth and the sea, but God separated the earth from the sea. God separated from the earth from the sea. In the last couple of weeks, we're talking about the separation of light from the darkness, and a separation of water from water. Now we're talking about the separation of earth from the sea. Now, understanding with the concept that the earth as the inheritance and the place for the relationship with God, and sea as the place coming out from the evil and the dragon monsters and all that, we need to understand why God separated the earth from the sea. And God has the purpose of that. And that's a very important picture that we need to understand. There God's salvation plan and the recreation plan. We'll look at that. Now, the Bible used the word the dry land. The Hebrew word for dry land is this, le-yab-ba-sha. Le-yab-ba-sha. And the Bible kept emphasizing on the dryness, dry, emphasizing dry. And we will see the same words are used in several places in the Old Testament. But first one is this, Exodus chapter 14:22. It says, "So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on each side." Do you know this story? This is a very famous story in the Exodus story, that people of Israelites were coming out from Egypt and they were going through the Red Sea, and God divided the Red Sea, and they were walking on the ground, right? And they could touch the walls of the sea, but the ground was dry. That's what it's talking about. They were walking through the dry ground. Now, the similar thing happened after that. Joshua chapter 4:22 in the handout, it says, "Then you can tell them," this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. Okay? So after Joshua took over the leadership of Moses, Joshua led the people of Israel to go into the land of Canaan. But there was a big river, which is the Jordan River. And of course, Fred and Renato, you were baptized in the Jordan Lake last week. But this is a big river, but they had to go through it. But they didn't have any boat for that many people. But God divided the Jordan River just like He divided the Red Sea. Now, when the people of Israel were walking through the river, they were actually walking on the dry ground. That dry ground, the dry ground that were used in the dividing the Red Sea, and all the same words were used in the Genesis chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. God made the dry ground, and it is the earth. The same word. Now, why is this so important? Because of this. When God took people out of somewhere, Egypt and in the wilderness, God used it. God made it as a dry ground by dividing the water. So after the dry ground, they could come to the promised land. So there is a God's salvation moment in the dry ground. Dry ground. The water is the evil place. The earth is the promise and inheritance. But to get to the earth, there should be a dividing water and going on the dry ground. So that's dry ground is a very important the process for the salvation. So, the coming out from the water, taking people out from the water, is a very important concept in the salvation. Even the Moses, the name of Moses means this, saving out of the water. Mo means water, and usis means save, deliver, suggesting a meaning a save from the water. Save from the water. So Moses' name, his name also means, his name itself means salvation. And that salvation is related to coming out from the water, which is the evil place. And to come out from the water, there should be a dry ground. And God used that dry ground. And also, God created human from the ground. So the ground, dry ground, really relates to our life and the salvation. Now, when the people of Israel was going through the ocean, walking on the dry ground, they were no longer in Egypt, right? But they're moving to a new land, which is going toward the promised land. So it is like the baptism. When you go down to the water, you die with Christ. When you come out from the water, you're living with Christ, and Christ is your Lord and Savior. It is not you, the Lord, in your life. So your life is changing. Your status, your identity is changed. So once you go through the water, walking on the dry ground, your identity, your status are changed. You're no longer master in your life, but Jesus Christ is your Lord and He is your Savior, because God took you out from the ocean. God took you out from the sea. And He moved you to the dry land, the promised land, through Jesus Christ. So this is a continuation of the baptism from last week. But God is continually speaking to us, even in the book of Genesis, in the story of the book of Genesis, to show us how God saves us and how He is working to save us, to recreate us through taking us from the ocean, saving us from the sea monsters, dragons, and He bringing us to the promised land. Now, let's go to the last point. God made the fruit-bearing trees and all that. In verse 11 and 13, it talks about the vegetation. But look at this. They were not the product of the powers of nature. Do you know why is it? Because sun and moon were created after these fruit-bearing trees were created. Isn't that amazing? God already created the light, but that light was different from the sun and moon. The light was from God Himself. So it was the work of a divine omnipotence by which the trees came into existence before their seed, and their fruit was produced in full development without expanding gradually under the influence of sunshine and rain. It shows us the power of God to bear fruit by the power of God, not depending on the sun and the moon, but that was totally depending on the light from God Himself. There was a life from God. It really shows us that we should not depend on the law of nature or science or those, but we need to depend on God Himself, who is the ultimate resource of life. And also, book of John, chapter 15, verse 5, it says, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me, and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from Jesus Christ, we cannot bear fruit. We're going to be fruitless apart from Jesus Christ. So He is the source of life. Let's depend on Him. Let's love Him. Let's just trust Him all the days of our life. Thank you. I love you, Net Church, and I will see you next week. God bless you.